The dust had not yet settled on the road when Nora Harper pushed open the door of the Silver Spur Saloon in Harlan Creek, Wyoming, in the spring of 1882, and every head in the room turned to look at her. Every head but one. She felt it instantly, the way a person feels the absence of something they have grown so accustomed to expecting that its disappearance becomes more noticeable than its presence ever was. Nora had walked into rooms full of men before. She had done it in Abilene, in Dodge City, in every dusty cattle town between Kansas and Wyoming, and the reaction was always the same. Eyes dragging across her like fingers on silk, conversations dropping to half sentences, the low whistle from someone in the corner who thought he was being charming. She had learned to harden herself against it, to pull her spine straight and her chin high and walk as though she neither noticed nor cared. She had become very good at that particular performance. But tonight the Silver Spur was packed wall to wall with cowboys, ranch hands, and drifters, and every single one of them looked up from their cards or their whiskey or their conversation the moment she stepped through the door, except for the man sitting alone at the far corner table, the one with a book open in front of him and a cup of coffee, not whiskey, steaming beside his right hand. He did not look up. He turned a page. Nora noticed that more than she noticed all the others. She had arrived in Harlan Creek 3 days ago aboard the Wells Fargo stage, carrying everything she owned in a single leather trunk and a carpetbag that had seen better decades. She was 26 years old, the daughter of a schoolteacher father who had died of fever in the winter of 1880 and a mother who had passed even earlier, when Nora was 12. She had survived by teaching school herself in Abilene for 3 years, but when the school board decided they preferred a married man for the position, a man with no teaching experience whatsoever, Nora had packed her belongings and answered an advertisement in a territorial newspaper seeking a schoolteacher for the growing settlement of Harlan Creek, Wyoming Territory. The pay was modest. The accommodations were described as suitable. The town was described as a fine and growing community of hardworking citizens. All 3 of those descriptions, Nora had discovered upon arrival, were generous interpretations of the truth. The pay was not quite modest. It was barely enough to cover her board at Mrs. Delacroix's rooming house. The accommodations were a single small room with a window that faced a fence. The town had fewer than 400 people and a main street that turned to mud whenever it rained, which it had done for 2 of the 3 days since her arrival. But the schoolhouse was real and solid, and the children were real and bright-eyed, and Nora Harper had not come all this way to turn around. She had come to the Silver Spur this particular evening not for entertainment, but because Mrs. Delacroix had informed her, with a meaningful lift of her eyebrow, that Sheriff Boyd Hennessy took supper there every Thursday and that Nora would want to introduce herself, being the new schoolteacher and all, since the sheriff was the man who kept things running in Harlan Creek. Nora had dressed in her best day dress, the deep green one with the small white collar that her father had always said brought out the color in her eyes, and she had walked the 4 blocks from the rooming house to the saloon in the early evening light. Now she stood just inside the doorway with 24 pairs of eyes on her and 1 pair conspicuously not. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and walked to the bar. "I'm looking for Sheriff Hennessy," she said to the barkeep, a broad man with enormous side whiskers named, according to the painted sign above the bar, Gus Millard. Gus Millard nodded toward a table near the front window where a heavy-set man in his 50s sat with a plate of something brown and a glass of beer. "That's him, miss." Nora thanked him and made her way to the sheriff's table. The introduction went smoothly enough. Boyd Hennessy was a man who had clearly once been formidable and had grown comfortable with his formidability, which meant he had let it soften at the edges without entirely losing its shape. He was polite to Nora in the manner of a man who considered himself important enough to be generous. He told her the children in Harlan Creek were good children mostly, and that she should come to him directly if she had any trouble, and that the previous teacher had been a Mr. Caldwell who had left under circumstances Hennessy described as best not discussed at supper. He seemed pleased by his own authority and by the fact that she was listening to it. Nora listened, asked the right questions, and kept a careful eye on the corner of the room. The man with the book had still not looked up. She excused herself from the sheriff after a decent interval and ordered a glass of lemonade from Gus Millard, which he produced with only mild surprise, and she took it to one of the smaller tables near the middle of the room. She was not in the habit of staying in saloons, but she was curious, and Nora Harper had never been very good at suppressing her curiosity. She could see the corner man clearly now. He was perhaps 30, give or take a year or two, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that carried several days of stubble, not from neglect, but in the way some men wore it, as though shaving was simply something that happened occasionally rather than daily. He wore a plain dark shirt and trousers that were clean but not new. His hands were large and brown from sun, and the way he held the book thumb along the spine, other fingers barely touching the pages, suggested he had held a great many books in his life. He wore no gun at the table, though a worn leather gun belt was draped over the back of his chair. His boots, she could see from here, were caked with honest mud. He turned another page. "That's Joseph McCrae," said a voice beside her, and Nora turned to find a young woman about her own age settling into the chair across from her with the ease of someone who considered the whole room her parlor. She had red hair and a forthright expression and was wearing an apron which suggested she worked here. "You were staring." "I was observing," Nora said. The young woman grinned. "My name's Cecily Malone. I wait tables here and I know everybody in this town." "Joseph McCrae, he's the one everybody's a little confused about. Came to Harlan Creek about a year ago, bought the old Whitfield ranch 2 miles out of town, fixed it up, and mostly keeps to himself. Runs cattle, though not many. People say he reads books." She said this last part with the mild wonder of someone describing an exotic animal. "Is that unusual?" Nora asked. "In a cattle town, a little." Cecily tilted her head. "He's not unfriendly exactly, just quiet. Comes in Thursday evenings, has coffee, reads for an hour, pays Gus, and leaves. Never causes trouble, never starts anything. Every woman in town has tried to get his attention at some point, and he's never seemed particularly moved by any of them." She paused. "You're the new school teacher, Nora Harper. Welcome to Harlan Creek, Miss Harper. You should know that you coming in tonight is the most interesting thing to happen in this saloon since Pete Dawson's horse came in last August and knocked over 3 tables." Nora laughed despite herself. It was the first real laugh she had produced since arriving in Wyoming, and it surprised her with its own warmth. "I only came to meet Sheriff Hennessy, and stayed to watch Joseph McCrae not watch you," Cecily said, with a grin that was too knowing to be innocent. Nora took a sip of her lemonade and said nothing. She went home that night thinking about the way a person could choose where to direct their attention, and how rare it was to meet someone who directed it somewhere other than where convention expected. The first week of school went by in a rush of names and faces, and the particular challenge of teaching 8 different grades in a single room with a blackboard that was missing a corner. Nora had 15 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, and she loved them from the first morning, even the ones who were determined not to cooperate. There was Tommy Briggs, 8 years old, who put a frog on her desk on the second day and watched her with enormous eyes to see what she would do. She had picked up the frog, carried it to the window, and released it with a calm that clearly shook him to his foundations, and after that he was her most devoted student. There was 11-year-old Clara Voss, who could already read at a level that would embarrass most adults, and who devoured every book Nora had brought with her in her trunk. There was 14-year-old Daniel McCrae, who sat in the back row and was quiet in a way that reminded her immediately of someone, though it took her 2 days to place it. On the 3rd day, she asked him directly, "Are you any relation to Joseph McCrae out on the Whitfield ranch?" Daniel looked up from the essay he was writing and said, "He's my brother, ma'am. I board in town with the Harpers, not relations of yours, I think, during the week for school. Joseph brings me Sunday evenings and fetches me Friday afternoons." Nora nodded and went back to the front of the room and told herself she was not cataloging this information in any particular way. On Friday afternoon, she was still in the schoolhouse when Daniel's ride arrived. She heard the horse outside and was erasing the blackboard when Daniel went to the door, and she heard a voice she had not heard before, low and even and unhurried, say, "Got everything?" "Yes," Daniel said. "There's a new teacher." A pause. "I know. Mrs. Delacroix told me." "She's pretty good," Daniel said, with the studied understatement of a 14-year-old who did not want to seem enthusiastic. "She didn't scream at the frog." Another pause, and then the voice said, with what sounded like it might be the edge of a smile hiding inside perfectly controlled words, "I imagine that's a solid quality in a teacher." Nora stayed at the blackboard until she heard hoofbeats fading down the road, and then she turned around to an empty room and stood very still for a moment, feeling the peculiar sensation of a conversation she had not been part of having affected her nonetheless. She met Joseph McCrae formally on a Sunday afternoon in late April, 3 weeks after her arrival. She was walking back from the churchyard. She had spent an hour reading in the small cemetery on the hill behind the Presbyterian church, because she found cemeteries peaceful in the way that places of completed things are peaceful, when a wagon came down the road from the direction of town, and the man driving it was Joseph McCrae, and in the back of the wagon was Daniel, and the moment Joseph saw her on the road he pulled the horses to a stop. "Miss Harper," Daniel called from the back. "Good afternoon, Daniel," she said, looking up at him and then, inevitably, at his brother. Joseph McCrae in daylight was a different experience from Joseph McCrae in the dim gold light of the Silver Spur. His eyes, she discovered, were a dark gray that managed to be neither cold nor warm, only extremely attentive, and they met hers directly with no performance in them, no calculation, no attempt at charm. He nodded once with a courtesy that was simple and unembellished. "Miss Harper," he said, "Joseph McCrae, I understand Daniel is doing well in your class." "He is. He has a good mind and he works hard." "Good." He seemed to mean it precisely as he said it, no more and no less. "Your ranch is out the western road," she said, and immediately felt slightly foolish for saying it, as though she had been caught with information she should not have. "2 miles out," he said, not seeming to find it strange. "You have settled in well, I'm told." "Who told you?" "Mrs. Delacroix, Gus Millard, the general consensus of Harlan Creek." He said it without irony or amusement, simply stating a fact. "It's a small town, so I've discovered." She looked at him for a moment. "You were reading Dickens the other night, at the saloon." He considered her for a moment with those gray eyes. "Bleak House," he said. "Have you read it?" "3 times." Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. Not surprise exactly. More like the look of someone who has found an expected door and found it opened onto a different room than expected. "It's the 3rd reading that pays off most," he said. "I think it's the 4th," she said. He looked at her for another moment, and this time there was something in it, not the lazy inspection she was accustomed to from men who looked at her, but something more like genuine curiosity, the way a person looks when they have encountered something that requires their actual attention. "Good afternoon, Miss Harper," he said, and clicked to the horses, and the wagon moved on. She stood in the road and watched it go, and the trees on either side of the road were covered in the pale green of new leaves, and somewhere up ahead a meadowlark was singing. She walked home thinking about the 4th reading of Bleak House. May arrived and brought with it better weather, and a school board meeting at which Nora was required to present her teaching plan for the year. The school board consisted of 3 men: Gerald Voss, who was Clara's father and a banker; Martin Ruiz, who ran the feed and grain and was broadly reasonable; and Franklin Bly, who owned the largest ranch in the county and who had, Nora discovered immediately, very decided opinions about what schoolchildren needed to learn and how much of it they needed. I'm not convinced, Bly said, leaning back in his chair with the satisfaction of a man who was always eventually agreed with, that these children require literature. Reading and numbers, that's what a ranch hand needs. Reading and numbers and an understanding of their station. With respect, Mr. Bly, Nora said, keeping her voice pleasant and her spine very straight, these children are not being educated to be ranch hands. They are being educated to be citizens. And citizens require more than reading and numbers. They require history, geography, literature, science, the full range of knowledge that will allow them to understand the world they inhabit. Bly's jaw tightened slightly. He was not accustomed to being contradicted, particularly by a woman, and particularly by one who had not yet been in the territory for 2 months. Gerald Voss cleared his throat. Miss Harper has Clara reading at an extraordinary level, Franklin. I have to say I find her approach sound. Martin Ruiz nodded. Franklin Bly was outvoted and knew it, and accepted it with the grace of a man who filed things away for future use. It was after this meeting, while Nora was walking home in the blue dusk, that she heard her name from behind and turned to find Joseph McCrae crossing the street toward her from the direction of the hardware store. He was carrying a wrapped parcel, and he looked as though he had just finished whatever business had brought him to town. I heard the school board met tonight, he said, falling into step beside her without any particular fanfare, as though they were in the habit of walking together. News travels fast. It's a small town. She laughed, because it was the same thing he had said on the road 2 weeks ago, and she recognized it as his way of acknowledging the absurdity of small-town information networks without condemning them. How did it go? He asked. I remained employed, she said. Mr. Bly and I had some differences of opinion regarding the purpose of education. He believes the purpose of education is to produce useful laborers. And I believe the purpose is to produce thinking human beings. Joseph was quiet for a moment. Daniel came home last Friday talking about the Reconstruction and the rights of the freed people in the South, he said. He had opinions, strong ones. Is that a problem? No, Joseph said. It's the first time I've heard him have strong opinions about anything outside of horses. A pause. He asked me what I thought about it. What did you say? I told him what I thought, he said, and his voice had that same quality it always seemed to have of things being said plainly, without decoration, without attempt to be impressive. That the things done in this country to people because of the color of their skin are a deep and lasting wrong, and that the failure of Reconstruction to protect those people is one of the great moral failures of our time. Nora stopped walking. He stopped too, a step ahead of her, and turned back. The evening light fell across his face at an angle that made the gray of his eyes look almost amber. You believe that, she said. It was not a question exactly. I do, he said simply. She looked at him for a moment with the particular feeling of someone encountering a landscape they did not expect to find beautiful and finding it is. So do I, she said. They resumed walking. He walked her to the door of Mrs. Delacroix's rooming house without discussing anything further of consequence, and when he said good evening, it was with the same quiet courtesy he seemed to apply to everything, and she went inside and sat at her small desk by the window that faced the fence, and found she could not immediately focus on the lesson plans she had intended to work on. June came on warm and smelling of sage and new grass, and Harlan Creek had a 4th of July dance scheduled for the first Saturday, which was early but which the town had decided to embrace because the weather had been good, and the cattle market was looking promising, and people wanted a reason to celebrate. The dance was held in the open lot behind the hardware store, with paper lanterns strung between the buildings and a fiddle player named Harris who was very enthusiastic and moderately talented. Nora went with Cecily Malone, who had become her closest friend in Harlan Creek, in the way that two women of similar intelligence and different circumstances find each other useful and eventually necessary. Cecily had grown up in Harlan Creek, had lost her mother young as well, and had been waitressing at the Silver Spur since she was old enough to carry a tray. She was bright and funny, and had a comprehensive and unsentimental understanding of the town and everyone in it. "Joseph McCrae will be here," Cecily said as they walked toward the music. "You say that as though it should be significant to me," Nora said. "It should be significant to approximately half the women in this town," Cecily said cheerfully. "I'm just narrowing it down to you because you're the only one he walked home. He was walking in the same direction." "Miss Harper," Cecily said with great patience, "in the time I have known Joseph McCrae, he has never once walked anywhere with anyone." The dance was already in full swing when they arrived. The lantern light was golden, and the air smelled of food from the table's misses. Briggs and several other women had set up along the fence, and the fiddle player was working through a Virginia reel with more gusto than accuracy. Nora drank punch and talked to several of the parents of her students, and allowed herself to be danced with by Martin Ruiz's eldest son, who was 19 and earnest and very nearly stepped on her feet only twice. She saw Joseph McCrae when he arrived, perhaps an hour into the evening, and she knew he had arrived because the crowd shifted slightly in the particular way it shifts when someone notable enters, even when, perhaps especially when, that someone does nothing to draw attention. He was wearing a cleaner shirt than usual, dark blue instead of dark brown, and he had shaved, which changed the architecture of his face enough that she registered it as a small surprise. He came with Daniel, who immediately went off to find boys his own age, and Joseph found a place at the edge of the gathering in the way of someone who attends out of community obligation, but finds it all somewhat loud. He did not look around the crowd in the scanning way people do when they are looking for someone. He looked at the fiddle player, then at the dancers, then at the food tables, in the orderly way of someone observing rather than participating. And then his eyes found hers because she was already looking, and for a moment neither of them did anything in particular, and then he nodded and she nodded back. He came over after another 10 minutes, not immediately, not in the way of a man who had been waiting for permission, but in the way of a man who moved when he decided to move. "Miss Harper," he said, "you're enjoying the dance." "Harris is very committed to that fiddle," she said. The corner of his mouth moved fractionally. She had begun to notice that this was what a smile looked like on Joseph McCrae, not an absence of expression, but a very contained and genuine version of one. "He plays every year. I believe the commitment compensates for most of the rest." "Are you going to dance?" she asked. "I don't dance particularly well," he said. "Neither does anyone else here from what I can tell." He looked at the dancing crowd, considered this, and then looked back at her. "That's a fair point," he said. They did not dance that night. They stood together at the edge of the dancing, which was in some ways more intimate than dancing would have been, because it required no particular excuse and gave them time to talk. They talked about books. She had been rereading Jane Eyre. He had just finished a collection of essays by Ralph Waldo Emerson, and they talked about the creek that ran behind the schoolhouse and whether it flooded in heavy rain. It did. He told her, memorably so, in 1880, and they talked about Daniel's progress and about the fact that Clara Voss had potential that went far beyond what Harlan Creek could offer her. "She should go east for school," Nora said, "when she's older." Vassar, if her father would agree to it. Would he? Gerald Voss loves his daughter very much. I think if someone helped him understand what she's capable of, he would find the courage. She paused. "Do you know him well?" "Well enough. He's a reasonable man, better than Bly." "Everyone is better than Bly," she said, and then felt slightly guilty. "That's uncharitable." "It's accurate," Joseph said. She laughed, and the lantern light caught her face, and she was aware of it not in the vain way, but in the way of someone who has been looked at so often by so many that they have developed a sensitivity to being observed, like an instrument too finely calibrated. But Joseph was not looking at her the way she was braced for. He was looking at her the way he looked at the fiddle player and the dancers, with genuine attention, the kind that takes in what is actually there rather than what the observer wants to project onto it. It was alarming, she realized, in its own way. More alarming than the staring, because this required her to be actually present rather than merely performing composure. She walked home alone that night. Joseph had stayed to help fold the tables, in the practical way of someone who sees what needs doing, and she sat at her desk by the window and wrote a long letter to her father's old friend in Abilene, Mrs. Calloway, describing Harlan Creek and the school and the people in it. She did not describe Joseph McCrae. She was not yet ready to put him into words, because words had a way of defining things, and she was not yet sure what it was she was looking at. The trouble with Franklin Bligh came in July, as trouble from people like Franklin Bligh tends to come slowly accumulated and then suddenly present. Bligh had 2 sons, both of them in their 20s and working the ranch, and he had never forgiven the school board for not overriding Nora's curriculum choices. He began making comments around town. Nora heard them secondhand through Cecily, who heard everything about how the new schoolteacher was filling children's heads with unnecessary ideas and political agitation. The Reconstruction conversation Daniel had brought home, which had apparently been repeated in some form by other children around dinner tables, had apparently reached Bligh and disturbed him. In mid-July, Bligh came to the schoolhouse. He came on a Tuesday afternoon, half an hour before the school day ended, and he knocked on the door in the manner of someone who considers knocking a formality rather than a request. Nora opened the door and found him standing on the step with his hat in his hands, which suggested he had at least the memory of what courtesy looked like. "Miss Harper," he said, "I want to talk to you about what you're teaching these children." "Come in then," she said, because she was not going to have the conversation in the doorway. He came in, looked at the students, all of whom were watching with great interest, and Nora said pleasantly, "Class, please continue with your reading for the next few minutes." She walked with Bligh to the far corner, where she could speak quietly. "I've been hearing," Bligh said, keeping his voice low but losing none of its authority, "that you've been teaching these children about political matters, about racial politics and such. That's not what this school is for." "The history of this country is not a political matter, Mr. Bligh," Nora said. "It is simply history. There are ways of presenting history that are inflammatory," he said, "and ways that are not. I expect a schoolteacher paid by this town to understand the difference." "I teach the children to think," she said. "I teach them facts and I teach them to draw their own conclusions. I consider that to be exactly what a schoolteacher should do." Bligh's jaw tightened in the way she had learned to recognize as his version of being very close to saying something he would probably not quite say. "There are people in this town who are not happy," he said. "I'd advise you to consider that." He left without waiting for her response, which was itself a kind of threat, the suggestion that he did not need to hear what she said because her response was not the point. The children had been watching very carefully and trying to appear as though they had not. Tommy Briggs, who at 8 was the most observant person in the room, said, "Is that man going to make you leave, Miss Harper?" "No," Nora said firmly. "He is not, now. Let us return to the lesson." She was shaken, though she did not let it show. She walked home that evening turning the encounter over in her mind, poking at it the way you poke at a sore tooth, not because it helps, but because you cannot stop. She did not want to leave Harlan Creek. She had not expected to find herself with that feeling quite so certainly, but there it was. She did not want to leave the school or the children or Cecily or the creek behind the schoolhouse or the meadowlarks or the evenings when the light turned the whole Main Street gold. She had not quite admitted to herself, yet, that Joseph McCrae was on the list. She was sitting on the small porch of Mrs. Delacroix's rooming house that evening in the last of the daylight when she heard a horse on the road and looked up, and it was him. He had a habit, she had noticed, of appearing at particular moments with no calculation she could detect, as though his timing were simply a byproduct of living his life in the same geography as hers rather than any design. He pulled up in front of the rooming house and looked at her on the porch. "You heard about Bligh," she said. "Small town," he said. "How quickly does news travel in this small town? Mrs. Delacroix's niece is Tommy Briggs's mother," he said. "So, approximately 3 hours. Nora let out a breath that was almost a laugh. He wants me to change what I teach. I know. I'm not going to. I know that too. He held the reins loosely in his hands, looking at her steadily. I want you to know that if Bly takes it further with the school board, he won't be the only voice in that room. Gerald Voss isn't going to dismiss a teacher who has his daughter reading above any level this town has seen, and Martin Ruiz has 2 boys who are thriving in your class. Bly would need a majority. She looked at him for a moment. You went and spoke to them. I had a conversation, he said, in his careful way that was not quite a denial and not quite a confirmation. Today, this afternoon. She felt something shift in her chest that was more than gratitude, and not yet anything she had a name for. She had been managing on her own for so long since her father's death, and before that in many of the ways that matter, that the simple fact of someone acting on her behalf without being asked, without wanting anything in return, without making a performance of it, was almost physically disorienting. Thank you, she said. You didn't have to do that. I'm aware, he said, without the self-congratulation that would have made it smaller. He looked at her for a moment longer and then said, He won't move you out of that school, Miss Harper. Not while there are people in this town who know your value. He rode on. She stayed on the porch until the light was entirely gone, with her hands folded in her lap and the warmth of July still rising from the road, and something moving slowly through her that she recognized eventually as the beginning of trusting someone. August was warm and golden and smelled of dry grass and late summer wildflowers. The school year had a break of 3 weeks in August, which the original school board had built in to allow older students to help with the harvest and the cattle work, and Nora used the time to do what she had been meaning to do since she arrived. She read everything she could find about the local geography and history, and she walked. She walked a great deal. She walked the creek trail and the road to the ridge and the long flat meadow that ran behind the eastern ranches. She had always been a person who processed the world through movement, and Harlan Creek's countryside was, she was discovering, genuinely beautiful in a way that asked nothing of you. It was simply there, enormous and quiet and real. One morning in mid-August, walking the road past the western ranches, she came to the gate of a property that had a sign reading McCrae in plain letters on a piece of weathered board, and she stood at the gate without meaning to stop and looked at the ranch beyond it. It was a modest spread, not small, but not pretentious either, with a solid house that had clearly been repaired extensively in the past year, its porch posts new and its roof patched with fresh wood, and a barn that was well maintained, and a pasture with a good number of cattle moving slowly in it, and several horses in a corral near the barn. A dog came around the corner of the house, a large, tan-colored animal of unclear ancestry, and stood at the gate and wagged its tail. "Hello," Nora said to the dog. "He's called Samuel," said a voice, and she looked up to find Joseph coming out of the barn with a length of rope in his hands, squinting a little against the morning sun. "He's entirely useless as a guard dog, as you can see. He seems friendly. He is, terminally so." Joseph came to the gate and Samuel pressed against his leg. "Were you out walking?" "I walk most mornings," she said. "I didn't know this was your ranch. I recognized the name on the sign." "Would you like to see it?" he said. She would like to see it, she discovered. She would like very much to see it. He opened the gate and showed her the property with the same matter-of-fact quality he brought to everything. No performance, no salesmanship, just simple pointing at things and explaining them. Here was where the original house had been before the fire, not this past fire, but a fire from 8 years ago before he bought the place. Here was where he had extended the south pasture by pulling down an old fence line. Here was the kitchen garden behind the house, which was producing well this year and which he tended himself because he found it satisfying. "A cattle rancher who keeps a kitchen garden," she said. "My mother kept one," he said simply. She believed a person should know how to feed themselves from the ground. "Your parents are gone, both. My father when I was 22, my mother when I was 24. That was 5 years ago." He paused. "I came west not long after. It seemed like the right direction." "And Daniel came with you?" He was 14 when our father died, 12 when our mother went. I was all he had. He said it without self-pity, the way someone states a fact about gravity. He's done well. He works hard. He's got more of our mother in him than I do. What do you have from her? She asked. He was quiet for a moment, and she thought she might have asked something too personal, gone too fast, and then he said, she loved books. She read everything she could get. She believed that a person who read was a person who was never entirely alone. Nora stood very still for a moment, because that sentence went straight through her like something that had been waiting to land. I think that too, she said. He looked at her with those steady gray eyes, and something passed between them that neither of them named, because naming it would have changed its quality, and it was exactly what it needed to be in that moment. He made her coffee in the kitchen, which was clean and spare, and had a shelf of books along one entire wall, and they sat across from each other at the plain wooden table and talked for 2 hours about everything from the territorial politics to the nature of solitude to the best and worst novels either of them had ever read. He was as opinionated on literature as he was apparently uninterested in performing opinions on most other social subjects, and it was a revelation. He had deep feelings about Dickens and clear disapproval of certain fashionable authors, and an almost evangelical enthusiasm for Thoreau, whom he quoted from memory with the ease of long acquaintance. When she left, walking back up the road to town with the late morning sun behind her, she was smiling in a way she did not bother to control. September brought the school year back with it, and with it a new development. Franklin Bligh had decided, apparently, to change tactics. He withdrew his opposition to Nora's curriculum, at least openly, and instead began a campaign of small, persistent social pressure, the kind that is harder to fight because it leaves no clear mark. He made comments at the general store about how the school teacher was a bit progressive, and perhaps not entirely suited to frontier life. He suggested to anyone who would listen that Harlan Creek might eventually want to think about a family man, for the position meaning, obviously, a man with a family, which meant a man. Nora was aware of all of it, because Cecily told her everything and Nora had her own ears. She was also aware that it was the kind of thing that could eventually erode a position even without any formal action, because reputation in a small town is both currency and constraint. She did not, however, spend much time worrying about it. She was spending her evenings, increasingly, in ways that left little room for worry. On Wednesday evenings, when Daniel stayed in town for school, Joseph came to town for supplies and stayed for coffee at the Silver Spur, and it had become a natural thing. She was not sure how it had become natural, only that it had for her to be at the Silver Spur on Wednesday evenings as well, and for them to sit across from each other at the corner table that had been his table for a year, and to talk. They talked about everything. It was the most extraordinary experience of Nora's adult life, to have someone who listened to what she said with genuine interest, and responded to it with what he actually thought rather than what he imagined she wanted to hear. Men of her experience came in roughly 2 types: those who performed in hopes of impressing her, and those who ignored her entirely. Joseph McCrae did neither. He engaged with her as though she were simply a person whose mind interested him, which was, she was beginning to understand, the most intimate thing she had ever experienced. She also noticed, with increasing frequency, the small things. The way he always made sure she had what she needed before settling to his own comfort, without any fanfare, moving a candle closer to her side of the table, because he had noticed she was squinting, shifting so that his shadow wasn't falling across her book. The way he always said what he thought, clearly and without qualification, but never made her feel that her different opinion was anything other than worthy of consideration. The way he laughed rarely, but genuinely, when something was actually funny, and it was a good laugh, low and real and unhurried. One Wednesday in late September, after they had been talking for nearly 2 hours and the Silver Spur had grown quieter around them as the evening wore on, She looked at him across the table and said, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes," he said. "That first night I came in here, the Thursday in March when I came to meet Sheriff Hennessy." She paused. "Everyone looked up when I walked in." "You didn't." He looked at her steadily. "I know," he said. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, not the silence of someone finding a comfortable answer, but the silence of someone being careful to say the true thing rather than the easy one. "I've spent a good part of my life watching how people respond to the arrival of someone new," he said, "particularly someone who is perceived as noteworthy. And I've noticed that the first response is almost never about the person. It's about the observer. What they want, what they project." He paused. "I was reading a good book. And I decided some years ago that I would rather form an impression of a person by meeting them than by looking at them across a room." Nora held that for a moment. "Most people would not put it that way. Most people would say they didn't notice," he said. "Which would be a lie. You're not easy to not notice." She was not accustomed to that particular kind of compliment, the one that told the truth without using it as currency. She found she did not know quite what to do with it. "That night," she said, "I noticed that you didn't look. I noticed it more than all the others who did." He was quiet, and his gray eyes were on her with that quality of actual attention, and the candle between them was burning low, and the saloon was nearly empty, and somewhere on the edge of the silence was the fiddle player from the dance, practicing something in another room. "I'm glad," he said finally, simply. She rode home that night on the sensation of something having shifted into place. October arrived with the first cold and the leaves turning on the cottonwoods along the creek, and with it came a crisis that put everything else in relief. Daniel became ill. It started as a cough, which was common enough in autumn, but within 5 days it had deepened into something that left him pale and sweating and unable to keep food down. The doctor who served Harlan Creek, a thin, methodical man named Dr. Price, who came from Cheyenne once a month and was otherwise available by a hard ride, happened to be in town and was called immediately. He diagnosed a serious inflammation of the lungs, told Joseph that Daniel needed rest and warmth and broth, and that the next 2 weeks would determine things. Nora found out on a Monday morning when Daniel was not in school, and Tommy Briggs, whose mother knew everything, told her with large eyes that Daniel McCrae was sick and it was bad. She went to Mrs. Harper's boarding house where Daniel stayed during the week and found Joseph there, having ridden in at dawn. He was sitting beside Daniel's bed with the stillness of a man who is holding himself together by the particular discipline of not moving, and he looked up when she came to the door, and his face was different. Not broken, not panicked, but stripped of its usual composure, the way a landscape looks when the light falls on it from an unexpected direction, and you see the actual terrain. "How is he?" she said quietly. "Holding," Joseph said. "Price says the first week is the worst. Is there anything I need?" He looked at her for a moment with the exhausted, unguarded look of someone who has been alone with fear for too long, and said, "No, thank you, you should go, you have school." "I can come back this afternoon," she said. He said nothing, which she had learned was his way of accepting something he needed but had not been able to ask for. She came back every afternoon for 10 days, bringing food from Mrs. Delacroix's kitchen and books, and sometimes just her presence, which she had learned could be its own form of usefulness. She sat with Daniel when Joseph needed to step out, or stepped out herself when Joseph needed to be alone with his brother. She read to Daniel from his favorite penny adventure novel, which was absolutely not on any curriculum she had designed, and which Daniel apparently loved with a passion bordering on devotion. She made sure Joseph ate, which he forgot to do, and she made sure he slept at least a few hours, which he resisted, and she was not particularly gentle about either requirement because he was not a man who responded well to gentle management. He responded to directness. "You need to sleep," she said on the 4th night, when she had come by to sit with Daniel for the evening so that Joseph could get more than the 2 hours he had been taking in the chair. "Go to the boarding house and sleep. I'm fine." You're not fine. You're gray and you haven't eaten properly in 4 days, and if Daniel recovers and you collapse from exhaustion, it will be of no use to either of you." He looked at her with the expression of a man who knows he is being managed and is too tired to object effectively. "Has anyone told you that you're bossy?" he said. "Several people," she said. "They were all wrong. I am simply correct." His face did something that was unmistakably a smile, a real one. She had seen the contained version many times, but this one was different, fuller, reaching the eyes unguarded. "Fine," he said. 2 hours. "At least 4, she said. He went. He slept for 6 hours and came back looking like a man who had recovered from something. Daniel turned the corner on the 11th day, his fever breaking in the early morning, and when Nora came by that afternoon, he was sitting up in bed eating soup with something approaching enthusiasm. Joseph was sitting in the chair beside the bed, and he looked, for the first time in almost 2 weeks, like himself, the composed, particular self she had learned to read. He looked up when she came in, and what crossed his face was uncomplicated and clear, relief and gratitude and something else that he pulled back into composure, but not quite fast enough. "He's better," he said. "I can see that," she said. "Hello, Daniel." "Miss Harper," Daniel said, somewhat thickly around the soup. "Thank you for reading me the Bullwhip Jack chapters. Those chapters will never appear on any examination," she said. "I know," he said with satisfaction. She left after 20 minutes, and Joseph followed her out onto the boarding house porch. The October air was cold and clear, with a sky so blue it almost hurt. "I want to say something," he said, "and I'm not sure exactly how to say it, which is unusual for me." She waited. "What you did these past 2 weeks," he said, "coming every day, sitting with him, making sure He stopped. "I am not used to being cared for," he said. "My entire adult life, I have been the one doing the caring. For Daniel, and before that for my parents. And it is a strange thing to have someone simply step into that." He was looking at her directly, with the fullness of his attention, the way he had looked at her that very first morning by the gate. "I am grateful, in a way that doesn't have a simple word." "You're welcome," she said, in the same way. He held her gaze for a long moment, and the cold air moved around them, and somewhere down the street a door opened and closed. "Nora," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name, and it landed with the weight of an intention. "Yes," she said. "I would like—" He stopped again, began again. "I have not been in the habit of wanting things that are not already mine to have," he said. "But I find I want to know if you might be willing to—" Another stop. The careful, unhurried man was carefully, unhurriedly working his way toward something that mattered, and she watched him do it without helping him, because she understood that this was his to say. "To walk with me," he said finally. "Not only on roads we happen to be sharing. To walk with me intentionally. To let me court you properly, if that is a word that means anything to you in this territory." Nora looked at him for a moment, at this man who did not stare at her across rooms, who listened when she spoke, who had gone to Gerald Voss and Martin Ruiz without being asked, who had fed a kitchen garden because his mother believed in it, who had cried, she thought, in the night during Daniel's worst days, though she had never said so. "It means something to me," she said. "Yes." The winter came early to Wyoming, as it tends to do, and the school year continued through November with a wood stove that Nora was glad of every morning. The courtship, as Joseph had called it, had a quality that suited both of them. It was not performative or rushed. They took walks on Sunday afternoons when the weather permitted. They continued their Wednesday evenings at the Silver Spur. He brought her books, once, a first edition of an Emerson collection that had been his mother's, which he pressed on her, and which she accepted with the understanding of what it was. She cooked for him on 2 occasions, using Mrs. Delacroix's kitchen, and he ate with the genuine appreciation of a man who feeds himself adequately but not well. They talked about their lives in the way of people who are discovering each other properly, filling in the shape of a person from the inside rather than the outline. She told him about her father, about what it was to grow up in a house full of books and no money and enormous love. He told her about growing up on a farm in Ohio, about his father who was a hard man but not an unkind one, about his mother who had been, by his account, one of the finest people he had ever known. He told her why he had come west not only for Daniel, but because something in the East had felt, after his parents' deaths, too finished, too already decided, and the West had seemed like a place where things were still being worked out. "Have you worked things out?" she asked on a Sunday in November, walking the creek trail in the cold, their breath making small clouds. "I'm working on it," he said, and looked at her sideways with that contained smile that she now knew well enough to read like a sentence. She took his arm, which was the first time she had done so, and he did not make anything of it, only adjusted slightly so that the contact was easy and natural, and they walked the rest of the trail that way in comfortable silence. In December, Franklin Bligh made his final move. It came in the form of a petition, 12 names, all of them either Bligh's employees or men who owed him favors, requesting that the school board reconsider Nora's appointment on the grounds of improper influence on the moral development of the children and teachings inconsistent with the values of the community. It was presented at the December school board meeting, which Nora was not initially informed of, a fact she learned from Cecily on the morning of the meeting. She arrived at the meeting, held in the back room of the hardware store, unannounced, and sat down in the empty chair at the end of the table with the calm of someone who has decided that the best response to being excluded is simply not to accept the exclusion. Bligh looked at her across the table with the compressed fury of a man who considers himself reasonable and is having difficulty with the fact that she persists. "Miss Harper," said Gerald Voss with evident relief. "Good. You should be here." Martin Ruiz nodded firmly. "I have 12 names," Bligh said, "people in this town who believe." "With respect," Nora said, "I would like to speak to the content of the petition if the board will allow it." "Please," Gerald Voss said. She spoke for 15 minutes. She did not raise her voice. She described each child in her class by name, their progress, their specific achievements. She described Clara Voss's reading level and her capacity for analytical thought. She described Tommy Briggs, who had arrived in September barely able to form letters and could now write full paragraphs about things that interested him. She described Daniel McCrae, and at this she paused slightly, aware that invoking Joseph McCrae's name was not entirely without self-interest, but the truth required it, who was among the most intellectually capable students she had taught, and who was developing into exactly the kind of thoughtful citizen that Harlan Creek and Wyoming Territory needed. "The question," she said finally, "is not whether I am teaching your children to think. I am. The question is whether you believe that is a harm or a benefit." She looked at each man at the table in turn, ending on Franklin Bligh. "Because I believe it is the only good thing an education can do. And I believe the parents of these children, if asked directly, would agree." The vote was 2-1. Bligh was the one. He left the meeting without speaking, and Nora understood that she had not made a friend, but she had also understood from the beginning that Franklin Bligh was not a friendship she was going to acquire. She walked out into the December evening and found Joseph waiting on the step outside, his hands in his coat pockets and his breath fogging the cold air. She stopped. "How did you know there was a meeting?" "Small town," he said. She felt the laugh rise up in her, warm and full. "You were going to come in." "If needed," he said. "The board voted in my favor." He looked at her for a moment, and what was in his face was uncomplicated pride, relief, and the particular warmth of a man who is very glad. "Good," he said. "You didn't need to be here." "I know," he said. She stood on the step looking at him in the cold December evening, with the stars coming out above the main street of Harlan Creek and the smoke rising from every chimney, and she thought about the word home, about how it is not a place but a state of being that can arrive without warning and attach itself to a geography with a ferocity you do not expect. "Walk me home," she said. "Yes," he said, and offered his arm, and she took it. Christmas came and went with its particular Western solemnity. The town put up a tree in the square, and there was a church service, and a dinner at the hotel to which most of the town was invited. Nora sat beside Joseph at the dinner, which was noted by everyone and commented on by everyone who did not note it directly, and Cecily caught her eye across the table and raised her glass with the expression of a woman who has been vindicated in every prediction. In January, on a cold, clear Sunday with the snow on the ground catching the afternoon light until everything glittered, Joseph brought her out to the ranch on the excuse of seeing the new foals. The mares had delivered early, which he said was unusual, and which she suspected was a pretense. Samuel the dog greeted her with excessive enthusiasm at the gate, and she spent 10 minutes letting him lean against her knees, while Joseph watched with an expression that was unmistakably fond. He showed her the foals, which were genuinely wonderful, leggy and uncertain and large-eyed, trembling slightly in the cold air of the barn. She stood at the stall door and watched them with uncomplicated delight, and then Joseph said from beside her, in the same tone he might use to discuss the foals or a book or the creek, "I'm in love with you." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the foals still, and then he turned to look at her, and his face had the stripped quality of a person who has committed to a course of action and is seeing it through. "I don't know how to say it with more words than that," he said. "I've tried to think of them. I am not a man who lacks for words, generally. But everything I think of seems like less than the actual thing, and the actual thing is simply that I am in love with you. Since approximately the night we walked home from the school board meeting in October, if you want a date. Before that in the making." Nora looked at him for a long, full moment, at this man who had not stared at her across a room, who had walked beside her on roads and talked to her across tables, and cared for his brother and his mother's garden and his library of books with equal quiet seriousness, who had offered to court her with the word properly, and meant it in every dimension. "I love you," she said. "I have been trying to decide for 3 months how much I love you, and I keep arriving at more than I expected." He reached out and took her hand, which he had not done before, and held it with the kind of certainty that has nothing to prove. "Then I'd like to ask you to marry me," he said. "Whenever you're ready. There is no hurry, but I'd like you to know that's what I'm asking." "I'm ready," she said. He looked at her, surprised for once, genuinely surprised, and it was an extraordinary thing to see. The usually composed face opened into something unguarded and warm and certain. "Now." "I don't mean this afternoon," she said, laughing. "I mean I am not a person who needs more time to be certain. I know my mind, Joseph. I have known it for some while." He squeezed her hand and then did something that surprised her. He lifted it and pressed his lips to the back of it very simply, with a tenderness that had nothing performed about it. Then he held it and they stood together in the barn with the two foals nosing each other in the stall and Samuel's distant tail wagging audible somewhere outside. "Spring," she said. "Marry me in spring when the creek meadow is green." "The creek meadow it is," he said. They were married on the 15th of May, 1883, in the creek meadow behind the schoolhouse, on a morning when the grass was the vivid green of something new, and the cottonwoods were in their pale early summer leaf, and the meadowlarks were singing from every fence post. The ceremony was conducted by the Presbyterian minister, Reverend Aldrich, who had been in Harlan Creek for 20 years, and who delivered the words with the dignity of long practice and something that looked very like genuine pleasure. Every child from Nora's school was there, which was her one condition of planning. Tommy Briggs wore his best shirt, which had clearly been starched within an inch of its life, and stood through the whole ceremony without fidgeting, which Nora knew was an act of love. Clara Voss cried, which she would later deny with great firmness. Daniel McCrae stood beside his brother and was steady and proud and blinked more than usual. Cecily Malone stood beside Nora in a dress of pale yellow and wiped her eyes with complete unself-consciousness and whispered, "I told you," at a moment when only Nora could hear. "You did," Nora whispered back. Even Gerald Voss and Martin Ruiz were there. Franklin Bly was not, but he was not missed. Joseph, at the front of the meadow in his good dark suit, watched her walk toward him through the grass with the same quality of attention she had first noticed in the Silver Spur. Not the staring of men who see what they want to project, but the full, honest attention of a person who is looking at what is actually there and finding it extraordinary. She reached him and took his hand, and he looked at her steadily and said nothing yet, because the Reverend was speaking, but his hand closed around hers with the certainty she had come to know, and the meadowlarks kept singing, and the cottonwoods kept their gentle moving, and the creek behind the schoolhouse ran on, clear and cold and full of spring. The reception was held in the lot behind the hardware store, same as the dance had been, and Harris the fiddle player had somehow improved over the winter, or perhaps the joy of the occasion lent him ability, because the music was genuinely good. Joseph danced with her. He had said he did not dance well, and this was accurate, but he danced with her with full attention and good humor about his own imprecision, and she found that dancing with someone who is giving you their complete genuine self is better than dancing with someone technically accomplished. Cecily danced with Daniel, who had turned 15 in March and had grown several inches and was beginning to look very like his brother, and who was red-faced with embarrassed pleasure throughout. Joseph brought Nora lemonade between dances and bent to say something in her ear about the Harris improvement theory, and she laughed with her head tipped back, and the paper lanterns were strung between the buildings again, and the evening was warm and full of the specific light of high country summer dusks. They went home to the ranch that night, to the house that Joseph had been quietly, carefully preparing for her since January, adding things without fanfare. A proper reading lamp by the best chair, more shelves in the main room, a cushion on the porch bench. Her books were already there because she had brought them over the week before, and they were on the shelves beside his, which struck her, looking at them, as one of the most intimate arrangements she had ever seen. Their books, not sorted by his or hers, simply alphabetical, sharing a shelf. Samuel met them at the gate with unprecedented enthusiasm, as though he had been told the occasion was important. "Samuel," she said, "you were at the wedding. You saw all of it." "He wasn't convinced it was real until we came home," Joseph said, which was probably the most purely whimsical thing she had ever heard him say, and she loved him for it with a sudden fierce warmth that nearly took her breath. They sat on the porch bench with the cushion she had teased him about buying and watched the stars come out over Wyoming, thick and brilliant and indifferent to human timelines, and she leaned against his shoulder and his arm came around her, and they sat in the comfortable silence of people who have already said the important things and do not need to fill the space. "Happy," he said after a while. "Extremely," she said. "Good," he said. And she could hear the smile in it. The summer of their first married year was one of the good ones, the kind that comes in the high plains when the rains have been right and the grass is strong and the cattle market is steady. Joseph worked the ranch with a hired hand he brought on in June, a quiet young man named Pete Morales who had come up from New Mexico and who proved to be the best horseman any of them had ever seen. Nora taught summer sessions 3 days a week for the children who wanted them, which was more than expected, because she had apparently made learning a thing children did not entirely dread. She also spent time on something she had been thinking about since February, a proper proposal to Gerald Voss about Clara's education. She had written to Vassar College in New York for their literature, had prepared a detailed account of Clara's abilities, and had, one afternoon in July, sat down with Gerald Voss at his bank and laid it all out. He read everything. He sat in silence for a long time. Then he said, "She's 13. We have time." 4 years is not as much time as it sounds, Nora said, and she needs to know it's possible. That matters. Knowing the thing is possible changes how you work toward it. Gerald Voss looked at his desk for another long moment, and Nora could see him arriving at a decision that was partly practical and partly something more personal. A father choosing to believe in the fullness of his daughter rather than the diminished version the world would tend to offer her. "All right," he said. "Talk to her. I'll back whatever she decides." Clara, when Nora told her, went very still in the way of someone receiving news they have been secretly hoping for so long that they had stopped believing it was real. Then she said, quietly and with total seriousness, I'll work hard." "I know you will," Nora said. In August, Nora discovered she was expecting a child. She told Joseph on a Sunday morning in the kitchen, standing at the stove, in the plain way she had learned was the way he preferred to receive important information, directly, without ceremony that might make it harder to respond genuinely. She simply said it. "I think we are going to have a child." He was at the table with his coffee and he set it down and looked at her across the kitchen, and his face went through several things in quick succession: surprise, which resolved into something that was not quite emotion and was not quite composure but was somewhere between them, somewhere real and unguarded. He got up from the table and came to where she was standing and put his arms around her, which he had never done in quite that way, not the careful, considered gesture she was accustomed to from him, but something more immediate, less managed. "Are you well?" he said against her hair. "Yes," she said, "I'm well." He held on for a while, which was its own answer. The pregnancy went smoothly through the autumn. Nora taught until November, when Mrs. Delacroix and several other women of the town made it clear that a visibly pregnant schoolteacher was considered, in the general opinion of Harlan Creek, somewhat beyond the pale. Nora had things to say about this opinion, which she said to Joseph with some vigor, and Joseph listened to all of it and then said, carefully, that perhaps a winter break would be sensible and she could return in the new year, and that the children would not dissolve in her absence if he hired someone for the interim. She was not pleased. She was also, in the privacy of her own heart, somewhat tired, and the school stove had been giving trouble, and the walk in the November cold was genuinely difficult. She accepted the break. She spent the winter at the ranch, which was a different kind of education. She learned the rhythms of the place in a way she had only partially understood before. The way the mornings sounded when the frost was hard, the way the horses moved in the corral in cold weather, the way the kitchen smelled when the bread was in the oven and the snow was falling beyond the window. She read a great deal. She and Joseph had a tradition now, which had grown up without being formally decided. In the evenings after supper, she read to him, or he read to her, alternating, going through whatever they were both interested in. That winter they went through Middlemark, which she had never read and which reduced her to silence at several points that she required him to discuss with her immediately. He had read it before and was patient with her reactions, which she found simultaneously touching and slightly annoying. "You knew it was coming," she said, about a particular turning point with some heat. "You could have warned me." "I could have," he said, "but then you wouldn't have had the experience of it." That's a very philosophical defense of letting me be ambushed by a novel. It seemed like a reasonable defense at the time. She threw a pillow at him, and he caught it, and the dog looked at both of them from the rug with the expression of an animal who has adjusted to a great deal. Their son was born on the 14th of March, 1884, in the early morning, with the first light coming through the bedroom window and the creek meadow visible as a pale shape in the dawn. He was large and healthy and protested his arrival with magnificent noise. Dr. Price, who had happened to be in town, declared him in excellent condition. Joseph held him for the first time with the contained intensity he brought to things that mattered most, looking down at the small face with an expression that was so unguarded it was almost difficult to witness, in the way of very private things. "James," Nora said. She had told him the name she wanted a month ago, and he had agreed with a simplicity that meant he had already been thinking of it. "James," he said quietly, as though saying it to the baby and himself simultaneously. Daniel came out to the ranch when he heard the news, riding in at a pace that suggested he had not been walking his horse. He stood in the doorway of the bedroom with his hat in his hands, looking at his nephew with an expression almost identical to his brother's, and Nora thought, these McCrae men with their still faces and their tremendous hearts. "He looks like you," Daniel said to Joseph. "He looks like Nora," Joseph said. "Both," Nora said from the bed. "He looks like both of us, which is as it should be." James McCrae was a year old when Daniel graduated from Harlan Creek School, the last year of his education there. As the school did not go beyond 14, And Nora was proud of him in the particular way she was proud of all her students, which was genuinely and specifically. Daniel had grown into a serious, capable young man who had his brother's quality of directness and his own quality of warmth, and who had already been talking to Joseph about learning the ranch's accounts. He should have more school, Nora said to Joseph, while James toddled determinedly across the kitchen floor toward Samuel, who accepted the attention with immense patience. I know, Joseph said. I've been thinking about Cheyenne. There's a good school there. I've been thinking about it too. She paused. He has a good mind, Joseph. He should use it. Daniel went to Cheyenne that fall, boarding with a family Joseph knew, and the letters came every few weeks, full of descriptions of his classes and the city and a girl in his mathematics course, named Ellen, who he described in terms of studied neutrality that convinced both Joseph and Nora instantly of the real state of affairs. In the spring of 1886, Clara Voss left for Vassar. Nora stood at the stage depot with Gerald Voss and his wife and Clara, who was 17 and terrified and radiant in equal measure, and Clara hugged her before getting into the coach with a fierceness that surprised them both. You did this, Clara said. You did this, Nora said firmly. I only told you it was possible, Clara went. The stage pulled out onto the Cheyenne Road in the early morning, and Gerald Voss stood beside Nora watching it go, and then he said very quietly, Thank you, and Nora knew he did not only mean for Clara. Thank you for believing her, Nora said. That summer, Nora discovered she was expecting again. Their daughter was born in the February of 1887, smaller than James had been, and with an expression of alert suspicion from her first moments that suggested she had arrived with opinions and would be sharing them. They named her Eleanor, for Nora's mother, and called her Ellie, which the name immediately consented to be. James, who was nearly 3, was enormously interested in his sister, and needed to be gently prevented from sharing all his toys with her simultaneously, before she was physically capable of receiving them. Joseph watched this with the expression Nora had come to think of as his best one, quiet, warm, present, needing nothing from the moment other than to be in it. The winter of Ellie's birth was also the winter that Pete Morales got married, to a girl from Laramie named Maria, who came to the ranch to see whether she could live in such a place, and decided she could, and moved into the small house Joseph had built for the hired hand when Pete had proven indispensable. Maria and Nora became friends in the way of two women of similar practical intelligence who find themselves in the same geography and are grateful for the company. And the ranch developed a pleasant communal quality, suppers that included Pete and Maria, afternoons when the children from both households played in the yard under Samuel's elderly but devoted supervision. Samuel, who was getting old, had given up pretending to be a guard dog and had accepted his role as witness and comfort, which he performed with undiminished dedication. Nora returned to teaching the following spring, when Ellie was old enough to spend the days with Maria, who had no children yet and was happy for the company. She returned to the school to find that it had been managed through her second absence by a Mr. Crawford, who had done adequately, and that the children were glad to have her back with an expressiveness that was deeply satisfying. Tommy Briggs was now 12, and had developed a particular aptitude for mathematics that Nora was encouraging with every resource she had. He reminded her of Clara, not in temperament. Clara had been intense and literary. Tommy was ebullient and systematic, but in the quality of a mind that exceeded what its setting could easily contain. Franklin Bligh had not, after his petition's failure, tried anything further with Nora's position. He remained a presence in the town, unavoidable in a community of 400, but kept his distance from the school board and from Nora personally. She did not consider this a victory so much as a working peace, which was all she had ever wanted. She did not need Bligh to approve of her. She only needed him not to obstruct. The years moved as years do in a place where the seasons are distinct and the work is real, each year shaped by weather and harvest, and the small but consequential events of a small community. Daniel came home from Cheyenne in 1888, bringing with him a diploma and Ellen, who was now his fiancée, and who turned out to be a small, precise woman from a Pennsylvania Quaker family who shook hands firmly and had clear opinions about most things, and whom Nora liked enormously within 20 minutes. Daniel married Ellen in October of 1888, in the same creek meadow where Nora and Joseph had married, which Joseph had suggested, and which made Nora press her lips together briefly against a feeling she preferred not to make public. The meadow was in its autumn state, the grass long and golden, the cottonwoods a bright yellow against the enormous blue of a Wyoming October sky. It was, if possible, even more beautiful than it had been in May 5 years before. After the ceremony, standing beside Joseph with James on her other side and Ellie on her hip, Nora watched Daniel and Ellen begin their life in the open air of the valley and felt the particular satisfaction of something coming around to a good place. "I liked this meadow first," she said quietly to Joseph. "I know," he said. "We should keep it," she said. "We should," he agreed. James tugged at her sleeve to show her something, a frog he had found near the creek bank, enormous and unimpressed with the wedding. She admired the frog with appropriate seriousness and watched her son return it to the creek bank with the careful hands of a child who has been taught to be gentle with small creatures, and then looked up at the sky. By 1890, Harlan Creek had grown to nearly 800 people, which by the standards of Wyoming Territory counted as something approaching substantial. There was now a proper general store, a second saloon that no one liked as much as the Silver Spur, a small hotel, and a new school building larger with 2 rooms, which meant Nora finally had a classroom that could reasonably fit her students, and a second teacher, a young woman named Miss Hartley who had come from Colorado and who was enthusiastic and somewhat overwhelmed, and whom Nora mentored with patient care. The school board, which had expanded to 5 members, now included a woman, a development that had required considerable persuasion, and that Nora had been central to achieving, quietly and over the course of 2 years, in the way of someone who knows that certain changes require patience and persistence rather than confrontation. The woman's name was Margaret Ruiz, Martin's wife, and she brought to the board a practical thoroughness that immediately improved its function. On a Thursday evening in October of 1890, Nora walked into the Silver Spur for the first time in several years. They still came occasionally, she and Joseph, but less often now. The demands of the ranch and the children and the school had rearranged their evenings. She was meeting Cecily, who had, the previous spring, been courted by and married Gus Millard's nephew, a solid man named Thomas, and who was now helping manage the saloon while Thomas helped Gus with the business side. She pushed open the door and every head turned, in the way she was entirely accustomed to and no longer needed to perform composure against, because the years and the specific geography of this life had given her something better than performance. It had given her herself, plainly and without apology. And across the room at the corner table with a book open and coffee beside him, Joseph McCrae looked up. He met her eyes and smiled, not the contained version but the real one, the one she had earned over years of knowing the difference. He raised a hand. She crossed the room to him instead of the bar and sat down across from him and said, "What are you reading?" "William James," he said. "The Principles of Psychology. It was just published." "Is it good?" "It is extraordinary," he said, with the particular enthusiasm he reserved for books that had genuinely moved him. "He says that the greatest discovery of his generation is that human beings can alter their lives by altering their attitudes." "I believe that," she said. "I know you do," he said. "You've been proving it for 8 years." Cecily arrived at the table with lemonade and coffee, looked at the two of them with the expression of a woman who has been right about something for a very long time and remains pleased about it, and said, "I'll leave you two to your books," and went back to the bar. Nora looked at Joseph across the table, at the man whose books were alphabetized beside hers on a long shelf at home, whose son looked increasingly like both of them, whose daughter had opinions that could fill a room, whose dog had grown old and slow and lay by the fire now more than he walked, whose ranch had a kitchen garden that still produced abundantly every summer, who still came to the Silver Spur on Thursday evenings and read. Though now he sometimes left the book closed and simply sat with his coffee and his thoughts, comfortable in the way of a person who has arrived somewhere he intended to be. "I have something to tell you," she said. He set the book down and looked at her with full attention. "Yes, we are expecting again," she said, "in the spring." He was quiet for a moment in the way of a man taking something in fully before responding. Then he said, "James will be 7. Ellie will be 4, old enough to be deeply opinionated about the matter." The smile came, the real one, reaching the eyes. "She will be opinionated about everything for the rest of her life." "She comes by it honestly," Nora said. He reached across the table and took her hand, the way he had in the barn on that January day 6 years ago, with the same certainty, and held it there in the middle of the table in the saloon where they had found each other, not finding each other, simply noticing the quality of a man's attention and the things it said about him. Their third child, another boy, was born in April of 1891, during a spring that came late and bloomed all at once in the way of delayed things, with wildflowers from the meadow to the ridge. They named him William, and James welcomed him with grave seriousness, and Ellie welcomed him by immediately attempting to demonstrate things he could not yet do, which seemed to be her primary mode of affection. The ranch was full of noise and life, and the particular organized chaos of a household with 3 children, 2 hired hands, a pair of working dogs. Samuel had died peacefully in the winter of 1890, sleeping by the fire, and had been replaced by 2 younger dogs who were collectively still developing Samuel's equanimity, and a regular traffic of students, neighbors, and the occasional traveling stranger who heard there was good hospitality on the McCrae place. Nora taught until the end of spring term and then through the summer with the afternoon sessions, and in the fall and winter and spring again. She had been doing it for 9 years by 1891, and the work had deepened in her the way work does when you are genuinely suited to it. She was better at it, not simply more practiced, but more able to see what each child actually needed as distinct from what the curriculum suggested. Miss Hartley had become a genuinely capable teacher, and less in need of mentorship and more a colleague. And the school was, by the general account of the community, as good a school as existed in Wyoming Territory. Clara Voss came home for a visit in the summer of 1891, 4 years after leaving for Vassar, now a woman of 22 who carried herself with the specific quality of someone who has been educated not only in subject matter, but in the knowledge of her own capability. She was teaching literature at a school in New York City, and was passionate about it in the way Nora recognized as genuine calling rather than chosen profession. She came to the ranch one afternoon and sat on the porch with Nora and drank coffee and talked about teaching and books and the differences between New York and Wyoming in terms that were funny and specific and loving toward both. And eventually she said, "I thought of you constantly my first year at Vassar. Every time it was hard, which was often, I thought of you telling me it was possible." "Was it possible?" Nora asked. "It was extraordinary," Clara said. "And possible." A pause. "I'm going to send you my students' essays to read when they're good enough. I want you to see what I'm doing." "I'd like that very much," Nora said. After Clara left, Nora sat on the porch alone for a while, watching the late summer light move across the pasture, and thought about the particular way good things multiply forward. The way a teacher's effect travels through a student into a classroom of their own, reaching children the original teacher will never meet, in a city she has never visited, with a quality that began, perhaps, in a conversation about Vassar in a small schoolroom in Wyoming. Joseph came out onto the porch and sat beside her on the bench and looked at her face and said, without preamble, "Good visit." "Very," she said. "She's wonderful. She's become exactly herself." "Because you let her," he said. "Because she was already herself. I just said the word possible." He was quiet for a moment. "You've said it to quite a few people," he said. "This town doesn't always acknowledge how much that word has changed in it." She looked at him. "Does that bother you?" "No," he said. "I'm well aware. That's enough for me." She leaned against his shoulder, and the evening settled around them. And from inside the house came the sound of James and Ellie in some kind of disagreement that sounded important to them and manageable from here, and William's babbling commentary on the proceedings, and the smell of the supper that Maria had put on before going home to her own household across the yard, where there was now a small child of her own, a boy named Louis, who was James's best friend and Ellie's devoted follower. "Tell me something," Nora said. "What would you like to know?" "Anything. Tell me something I don't know." He was quiet for a moment in the particular way that meant he was actually thinking about it rather than reaching for a convenient answer. Then he said, "I read somewhere once that the meadowlark's song varies by region. The same bird, but the song changes depending on where it learns it. Wyoming meadowlarks sound different from Kansas meadowlarks." She listened for a moment. Somewhere in the pasture, very faint in the cooling evening air, a meadowlark was singing. She had heard it every evening since she came to this ranch. She had assumed it was the same quality everywhere. "Is that true?" she said. "I believe so," he said. "I would have to verify it." "Then let's say it's true," she said. "The Wyoming meadowlark is its own thing. Like Wyoming schoolteachers," he said. She laughed, and he held her there on the bench in the evening, and the children's voices settled into something more peaceful inside, and the meadowlark sang its regional, specific Harlan Creek version of the song it knew, and the cottonwoods along the creek were the deep heavy green of late summer, and above the ranch the Wyoming sky was going through its daily transformation into something so vast and so filled with stars that it made every human arrangement seem both very small and entirely necessary. In the spring of 1893, Daniel and Ellen had their first child, a boy they named Robert, and who arrived in the world with his father's dark hair and his mother's precise, considering expression, and who was adored by James and Ellie as only a baby cousin can be adored by children old enough to find a baby wonderful without needing to compete with one. The extended McCrae family had become, in the years since Joseph had come west with his younger brother and bought the old Whitfield Ranch, something that occupied a specific and valued place in Harlan Creek's social fabric. Not because of wealth, the ranch was comfortable but not grand, and not because of social performance, because neither Joseph nor Nora had ever been particularly interested in performing, but because of a quality of realness that the people of the community could feel, the way people can always feel whether a thing is genuine or constructed. Joseph continued to come to the Silver Spur on Thursday evenings. He continued to read. He continued to have coffee rather than whiskey. Newcomers to town who had not been told about him sometimes wondered at the quiet man in the corner with the book, and someone always told them who he was, told them about the ranch and the family and the schoolteacher wife who had stayed in Harlan Creek when she might have gone anywhere. Nora continued to teach. She taught William when he was old enough, and felt the strange pleasure of having her own child as her student, which was complicated and rewarding in approximately equal measure. William was a different kind of learner than either of his siblings. He was methodical and curious, and had a tendency to ask questions that required her to actually think before answering, which she considered the highest compliment a student could offer a teacher. Ellie grew into a young woman of fierce intelligence and enormous warmth, who would have been exactly what Clara had been 10 years earlier, except that Ellie was not interested in literature. She was interested in medicine. This was discovered when she was 9 and read a medical almanac she found on her father's bookshelf and announced that she intended to be a doctor. Joseph had looked at Nora over the almanac and said nothing. Nora had said to Ellie, "Then let's find out how that's done," and begun the long project of educating a girl in a time and place that was not entirely ready for what she was becoming. That was the ongoing project, and it was far from finished, but it was real, and Nora Harper McCrae had never been interested in projects that were already finished. On an evening in June of 1895, 13 years after Nora had pushed open the door of the Silver Spur and walked into a room full of staring men and one man who was reading Bleak House, she was sitting on the porch of the ranch house with a book in her lap and Joseph beside her, and the three children, James at 11, Ellie at 8, William at 4, somewhere in the yard doing things that sounded safe enough not to investigate. The cottonwoods were in their summer fullness, and the pasture was green, and the horses were moving slowly in the corral and Samuel's successors, a pair of dogs named after two of Nora's favorite literary characters, Dorothea and Rochester, which Joseph had accepted with equanimity, were lying in the dust of the yard. James came onto the porch carrying a book he had clearly been reading outside, because it had grass in the spine. He was brown from summer and tall for his age, and had the gray eyes. "Pa," he said, "is it true that the Wyoming meadowlark song is different from birds in other states?" Nora looked at Joseph. Joseph looked at her. "Where did you hear that?" Joseph said. "I read it," James said, with the ease of a child who reads as naturally as breathing. "In a naturalist's journal Ma had on the shelf. It said all migratory birds adapt their songs to the region where they spend the most time, and that even birds of the same species can have regional accents basically." "Yes," Joseph said, "that appears to be true. So the meadowlarks here are Harlan Creek meadowlarks," James said, thinking it through. "Specifically." "That's what I understand," Joseph said. James considered this for a moment with the particular pleasured satisfaction of a fact that has been confirmed, and then said, "Good," and went back down into the yard, apparently satisfied. Nora looked at Joseph and Joseph looked at Nora, and the look between them was full of the years and the children and the books and the creek meadow and all of it, everything, the whole long, beautiful, complicated, real thing of their life together. "Good," Nora said. "Good," Joseph agreed. In the yard, Ellie was teaching William something that seemed to involve considerable repetition and great patience on her part, and above the ranch the Wyoming sky was enormous and full of the last gold of a summer evening, and from the pasture the meadowlark was singing its particular song, the Harlan Creek version, the Wyoming version, adapted and specific and entirely its own. Nora opened her book. Joseph opened his. The porch was warm and the evening was long, and the world continued in its turning, and everything that needed to be resolved was resolved, and everything that needed to be built had been built, and the family that had begun with a man who did not stare when a woman walked into a room sat together in the enduring light of a June evening in Wyoming and read, and did not need the light to last forever, only long enough, which it did. It always did.